I think we need to address the budget concerns. You as a Brazil rice.
I agree. The current proposal is not sustainable in the long term.
The lights of the debate stage burned hot, that manufactured brightness meant to expose every flinch, every tremor. Tim Scott leaned forward, voice sharpened, words dripping with that practiced composure that so often passed for authority. His jab cut across the microphones with surgical precision, condescending, calculated, the kind of remark meant not just to dismiss Jasmine Crockett, but to remind her, and the audience, that he believed he owned the floor. And then silence. A half beat that stretched too long. A camera flash caught her eyes narrowing, her jaw setting. Crockett didn't need to say a word yet. The electricity of her pause was louder than any rebuttal. Freeze frame. The question hung in the air like smoke curling under a closed door. Did Tim Scott just try to silence Jasmine Crockett on national TV? That's how it felt. Not a disagreement, but a dismissal. Public, pointed, meant to shrink her space. Millions of viewers watching from living rooms and phones leaned forward, their pulses quickening, waiting for what would follow. And Crockett, she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. Instead, she loaded her words like an arrow stretched taut against the bow. The first line of her clapback slipped like a spark. Sharp, biting, impossible to ignore. A single sentence that told him, told the room, told the nation. You don't get to erase me with a smirk. That was the preview. Just the edge of the blade. The full swing had not yet landed, and already the air quivered with anticipation. Cameras cut to Scott. His practiced half-smile faltered, just barely. But even that tiny twitch was enough to betray the truth. He hadn't expected resistance. He had expected compliance. And that is what made the moment electric. Because when the dismissed speak, when the underestimated fire back, it doesn't just sting, it rattles the entire stage. The audience could feel it before it even broke. Reporters shifted in their seats, fingers hovered over keyboards. Social feeds bristled with unfinished tweets, because they knew something was coming. But what happened next left even Scott's allies stunned. This wasn't going to be another forgettable exchange. This was about to be the epic reversal, the kind of clapback that doesn't just defend dignity, it flips the power dynamic in front of millions, and it was only just beginning. By 2025, the debates had stopped feeling like debates. They weren't forums of polite disagreement, they weren't sober exchanges of policy. They had become something else entirely. Battlegrounds where culture, race, and gender were thrown together like condoling, waiting for a spark. Every word carried the weight of more than policy. It was identity, history, belonging. And when the cameras turned on, that tension pressed down on the stage like a storm heavy with thunder, waiting to break. Tim Scott entered those debates polished, rehearsed, and armored. He knew how to glide past criticism, how to flash the smile that seemed reassuring but often concealed a sharper edge. For years, he had leaned on the establishment's invisible scaffolding, a system that rewarded composure over candor, calculation over conviction. He played the game with the rules written in his favor, knowing when to appear gracious and when to deliver a sting. He was supporters, he was steady, to his critics, he was slippery. But either way, he was a man of the machine, fluent in its rhythms, fluent in its games. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett stood as something far different. She wasn't polished in the way Scott was. She was fire wrapped in human form, sharp edges on purpose. Where he glided, she cut. Where he played the insider's tune, she brought the outsider's defiance. Crockett didn't need the old establishment to validate her. Her strength was in being dismissed, in being underestimated. Because every time she was told she was too loud, too brash, too unapologetic, it only made her more dangerous. She knew that being written off was her superpower because it left her free to shock, to disrupt, to command space without asking permission. And so, the clash between them wasn't simply two politicians trading lines. It was a collision of archetypes. Scott, the insider who spoke in the language of power games, tried to press her into silence with one cutting remark. Crockett, the truth teller with fire in her chest, refused to bow. It wasn't just man against woman or establishment against insurgent. It was the very question of who gets to define truth, dignity, and authority when millions are watching. For Scott, authority was hierarchy. Whoever controlled the frame controlled the outcome. Whoever got the last calm word was the victor. That was the old creed. For Crockett, dignity meant refusing to be silenced, even if it meant breaking the rhythm, even if it meant the risk of being called unruly. She wasn't fighting to win a point, she was fighting to reclaim space. And that made their exchange bigger than either of them. To the viewers at home, it wasn't a debate about policy points or poll numbers. It was a symbolic duel, one that mirrored dinner table arguments, office conversations, the fights happening in classrooms and communities. When Scott tried to box her in, It echoed the voices that had tried to box so many others in. And when she answered with defiance, she carried the weight of everyone who had ever wanted to say the words that burned on the tip of their tongue but were too often swallowed. That was the heart of the polarity, his smug composure versus her grounded authenticity, his dismissal versus her refusal to be dismissed, his attempt to frame the moment versus her insistence on reframing it in real time. The room felt it. The viewers felt it. The moderators felt it too, that uneasy vibration when control begins to slip. This wasn't going to be a clash that faded by the next commercial break. The storm had gathered. The spark had been struck. The stage was set for a confrontation neither side could walk away from. Tim Scott had built a career on composure. His brand was calm authority, the voice that never cracked, the smile that never slipped, the tone carefully measured to appear above the fray. He knew how to hold still while the storm swirled around him, to look unbothered when others lost control. It was a performance of steadiness, the kind that reassured allies and disarmed critics. But beneath that surface calm, another pattern simmered. Scott had mastered the art of throwing shade with a velvet glove. He could dismiss an opponent without raising his voice, belittle an argument without seeming cruel, and cut someone down with a single polite phrase dressed as reason. It was a talent that earned him respect in political circles, but also suspicion, because every polished smile carried a hint of something sharper, something smug. He became the man who could dodge accountability, not by shouting but by smoothing the air with words that seemed harmless until you realized they weren't. For years, that strategy worked. In rooms filled with insiders, it made him untouchable. Opponents who pushed back too hard looked shrill while Scott looked unflappable. He had turned restraint into a weapon, but irony has sharp teeth. What once made him untouchable became brittle when faced with someone unwilling to play his game. His composure, once a shield, now made him look hollow. His calm tone, once his greatest strength, revealed its weakness when met with fire that refused to be smothered. Against a voice unafraid to punch back, his quiet authority no longer looked noble. It looked arrogant. It looked evasive. And in that arrogance lay the seed of his unraveling. Jasmine Crockett's rise came with a shadow that seemed to follow her into every room. The media painted her with the same brush over and over again. Too emotional. Too sharp, too angry. Each headline recycled the same caricature. Each panel discussion found a way to reduce her fire into a flaw. The labels clung like smoke, impossible to shake, whispered with the weight of judgment before she even spoke a word. Critics turned her sharpness into spectacle. Clips of her questioning opponents were stripped of context, replayed as proof of volatility rather than conviction. Commentators shook their heads, framing her intensity as unprofessional, her refusal to soften as dangerous. And inside the halls of power, the interruptions came like clockwork, men talking over her, colleagues dismissing her points, her voice forced to climb over a wall of casual contempt just to be heard. The frustration was its own kind of burden. Every time she pressed forward, another wave of doubt and dismissal waited, daring her to stumble. It wasn't just politics she fought against. It was the centuries-old stereotype stacked against women who refused to smile politely while being erased. Crockett knew the double bind too well. Speak with passion and you're hysterical, hold back and you're invisible. But the weight that was meant to break her instead sharpened her resolve. Each attempt to shrink her only clarified the truth. If she wanted space, she would have to seize it and seize it loudly. And on that debate stage, under the blinding lights and the scrutiny of millions, she felt the old pattern tightening its grip once more. Another interruption, another dismissal, another attempt to shove her into silence. But this time Crockett refused to play small. The air between them grew thick, charged like static before a storm. Tim Scott leaned in with that same polished calm, but this time his words carried an edge meant to slice. He spoke over Crockett, not once, not twice, but again and again, each interruption deliberate, each smirk telegraphing control. His smile was the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all, more a declaration that he owned the stage. And every time she drew breath to answer, his voice arrived half a beat quicker, cutting her off like a gavel striking down before the sentence was complete. Crockett sat forward, shoulders square, hands folded with tension just beneath the surface. Her eyes tracked him steadily, unflinching. Her body didn't lunge, didn't flail. She knew too well the trap waiting for her if she let frustration spill into fire too soon. The composure cost her, though. You could see it in the tightness of her jaw, the pause before each exhale. But she refused to break. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was coiled restraint, a bowstring drawn back waiting. The cameras caught everything. The interruptions, the dismissive tilt of Scott's chin, the faint curl of his lips. And while the stage played out under hot lights, the audience outside was already erupting. Social media lit up like a fuse burning fast. Tweets flew. Why does he keep talking over her? This is hard to watch. Has not debating. He's trying to silence her. Clips of the moment spread before the debate was even over. Each replayed interruption a spark to the firestorm. Inside the hall, the tension swelled. Some in the audience shifted in their seats, restless, the discomfort creeping from row to row. The moderators exchanged glances, their attempts to balance the conversation falling flat as Scott pressed harder, determined to dominate. It was no longer about policy, no longer about answers. It had become a contest of presence, of who would hold space and who would be pushed aside. For Crockett, it was more than professional. It was personal, visceral. Every interruption echoed every past dismissal. Every smirk replayed the centuries of voices telling women like her to sit down, to be quiet, to wait their turn. The moment wasn't just unfolding on stage, it was pulling the weight of history into the room. Scott's confidence swelled with each cut, in as though victory could be claimed by sheer volume, by the illusion of composure maintained under pressure. Yet that same confidence began to reveal its cracks. Because the longer he pressed, the clearer it became this wasn't control. It was desperation dressed as calm. Crockett's restraint became its own spectacle. She didn't mirror his interruptions. She didn't scramble to claw back time. Instead, she let the silence after his jabs linger, heavy, uncomfortable, until the audience could feel it themselves. She understood something he had forgotten, that sometimes the refusal to react is its own kind of power. And then came the ripple. The audience leaned, not toward him, but toward her. The viewers at home began to anticipate her voice, not his. Social feeds flipped, not mocking her silence but demanding her eruption. Let her speak. Hayes about to regret this. The tension was no longer whether Scott would dominate. It was when Crockett would finally unleash the storm she was holding back. The debate had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. It was no longer about who had the better point. It had become a test of dignity, a public trial by fire in front of millions. Every second Scott talked over her, he only raised the stakes higher. Every smirk etched itself into memory, not as authority, but as arrogance. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a battle for respect, live and unfiltered, with the whole nation as jury. And just when it seemed Scott had pressed her into silence, just when the interruptions threatened to bury her voice, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her eyes lit not with frustration, but with the precision of someone who knows exactly what's coming next. And then came the moment no one was prepared for. The silence that followed Scott's last interruption was not ordinary silence. It was sharp, like glass suspended in midair, the kind that makes people stop shifting in their seats, the kind that carries the weight of something about to snap. Crockett leaned into her microphone, her eyes locked on him, not pleading, not defensive, but steady, almost amused. She inhaled slowly, as if savoring the anticipation. Then, with the precision of a marksman, she let the first arrow fly. Senator, if you think raising your voice makes your argument stronger, then you've already admitted your facts are weak. The words landed with a crack, clean and undeniable. The audience froze, then a ripple of gasps and murmurs broke through. Scott blinked, a flicker of surprise breaking his composure. Crockett wasn't shouting, she wasn't flustered, she was calm, and that calm was sharper than any jab he had delivered. She didn't stop. You've interrupted me 3 times now, and still, you haven't answered the question I asked. Maybe you're hoping if you talk long enough, nobody notices. But, Senator, we notice. Oh, we notice. The pause that followed wasn't filler, it was theater. Every word was deliberate, measured, the cadence of someone who knew her lines would echo far beyond the room. Twitter timelines lit up instantly. She's cooking him. Crockett is on fire. Replay that line right now. A Scot shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying the fracture in his calm mask. His weaponized composure, the brand he had polished for years, was suddenly cracking under the spotlight. Crockett pressed on, the fire in her voice building, but not wild. It was righteous, controlled, devastating. You tell me I'm emotional, but here's the truth. Facts without passion are lies waiting to be excused. You stand here pretending calm is the same as honest. It's not. Calm doesn't mean right, and loud doesn't mean wrong. What matters is whether the words match reality, and right now, your words don't. The hall broke into audible reaction. A wave of gasps, then a surge of applause that moderators tried and failed to smother. The camera caught Scott, his lips parting as though to respond, but no words came. Crockett wasn't finished. You say you respect this institution, but respect isn't interrupting colleagues to hear your own voice echo. Respect is letting the truth breathe, even when it makes you uncomfortable. So if my tone bothers you, maybe the problem isn't my tone, it's the truth you don't want to hear. That was the dagger. The line hit like a thunderclap, and the audience erupted again. On social media, hashtags formed in real time: Crockett Clapback, Truth Hurts, a speechless Scott. Clips of her words, subtitled and cut into 15-second loops, spread like sparks into dry brush. Within minutes, her face filled feeds across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. Scott's composure disintegrated in slow motion. He shifted again, glanced down at his notes, adjusted his cufflinks. His silence, once a weapon, now looked like retreat. He had spent years cultivating the image of a man unflappable, untouchable. Yet here he was, stunned into stillness by a clapback that had flipped the balance of the entire debate. Crockett sensed the shift and seized it. She straightened, voice rising, not in shrillness, but in resonance, a rhythm that carried like gospel through the hall. You've tried to make me small, Senator. You've tried to talk over me, to erase me, to pretend my words don't carry weight. But look around this room. Look at them. She gestured not just to the audience in the chamber, but beyond it, to the invisible millions watching from couches, buses, phones in the palms of their hands. They're not here for the interruptions. They're here for the truth. And tonight, the truth isn't yours. The line detonated. Applause swelled, drowning out any attempt at interruption. Moderators called for order, but the order had already been decided. The floor belonged to her now, and the betrayal was clear. Scott's own attack, meant to silence her, had boomeranged. His smug dismissal became evidence of arrogance. His attempt to control the frame exposed his fear of losing it. Every interruption now looked like weakness. Every smirk now looked hollow. For once, silence wasn't power, it was defeat, and it wasn't just in the room. On television screens, analysts interrupted their own commentary mid-sentence to marvel at the reversal. Headlines began drafting themselves in real time. Crockett floors Scott. Clapback heard round the chamber. Hashtags trended higher by the second, drowning out the debate itself. The exchange had escaped the confines of politics and become something larger, a cultural moment. Scott finally leaned into his microphone as if to recover, but the words stumbled out thin, defensive, a shadow of the authority he once projected. The contrast was brutal. Every second he spoke only highlighted the silence that had left him speechless moments before. His voice didn't command, it pleaded, and Crockett didn't even need to answer. The damage was done. She sat back, the faintest trace of a smile playing across her lips, not smug but certain. She knew the tide had shifted. She had seized the floor, the narrative, the frame. The debate was no longer about policy or performance. It was about presence. And in that contest, she had claimed the crown. The room hummed with energy, the kind of energy that makes history replay itself long after the moment has passed. The reversal was complete. Scott, who had walked in armored by calm authority, left exposed, unraveled, undone. And Crockett, who had been underestimated, interrupted, and dismissed, now stood as the voice everyone was quoting. The name everyone was tweeting, the moment everyone would remember. The silence that had once shielded Scott was gone, replaced by an echoing awareness that the clash was bigger than two people trading barbs. In the aftermath of Crockett's clapback, the debate stage itself felt transformed, no longer a contest of talking points, but a battlefield of two visions of politics. On one side stood Scott, polished and practiced, the embodiment of old politics. His style was steeped in the art of talking down, calm as performance, composure as armor, authority as assumption. He represented the familiar script, the voice of institutions that had long thrived on condescension disguised as leadership. On the other side stood Crockett, her voice ringing with unapologetic truth. No filters, no hedging, no pandering. Her strength didn't come from rehearsed posture or scripted sound bites. It came from refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for passion, refusing to let the weight of stereotype drown her out. Hers was the language of the new politics, direct, defiant, alive. The clash became more than argument, it became archetype. Old order versus rising voice, calculation versus authenticity, deference demanded versus dignity reclaimed. As moderators scrambled to redirect, the moment was already escaping the stage, spilling into living rooms, phones, and headlines. A rapid-fire montage unfolded across the media spectrum. Cable news anchors leaned forward in astonishment. That was a turning point. Morning shows replayed the clip on loop. Digital outlets dropped bold headlines. Crockett commands the room. Scott left speechless. But the split coverage revealed the fractured lines of the nation. Some networks praised Scott for staying above the fray, for embodying steadiness against Crockett's fire. Yet those defenses felt thin, out of step with the visceral reaction spreading online. The majority didn't see steadiness, they saw evasion. They didn't see calm, they saw condescension. And they didn't see Crockett as too emotional. They saw her as the only one daring enough to puncture the script. Social media captured the shift in real time. Memes flooded timelines, Scott with captions like, "Loading, please wait," juxtaposed against Crockett framed as a superhero mid-strike. Short clips hit millions of views before the debate even ended. The court of public opinion, unfiltered and merciless, tilted decisively in her favor. Yet the deeper shift was emotional. The outrage that had crackled at Scott's smug interruptions transformed into awe as Crockett took control. Audiences who had braced themselves for another spectacle of dismissal suddenly found themselves cheering. What was meant to humiliate her instead magnified her presence. What was supposed to diminish her instead crowned her as the moment's undeniable center. And Scott, the seasoned player, became the symbol of something he had never intended, the arrogance of a politics past its expiration date. The tension in the room had not disappeared. It had transmuted. Every gaze, every camera, every tweet carried the weight of a realization. They had just witnessed not only a personal reversal, but a cultural one. The clash was no longer just about words exchanged in a debate hall. It was about who gets to speak with authority in America's future. Crockett had not only survived the ambush, she had turned it into a showcase. And in doing so, she exposed Scott's greatest liability, that composure without authenticity collapses when confronted with fearless truth. As the debate carried on, both candidates tried to pivot back to policy, but the air had changed. Every word from Scott now sounded thinner, smaller, overshadowed by the silence that had betrayed him. Every glance toward Crockett reminded the audience of the clapback that had already rewritten the night. And so the confrontation left its imprint not as a fleeting exchange but as a fracture line dividing old politics from new. But even as Crockett claimed victory, the political ripple effect had only begun. When the cameras dimmed and the roar of the audience settled into memory, Jasmine Crockett finally allowed herself a breath. For hours, her mind had been a taut wire, every word balanced against the weight of expectation. Now, in the quiet after the storm, the truth she carried settled deeper. She had been underestimated, again. And once more, she had proven them wrong. Vindication was never as clean as it looked from the outside. To the world, the clapback was lightning, a strike that seared itself into history. But for Crockett, it carried the echoes of every dismissal, every raised eyebrow, every whisper that she was too loud, too much, too unpolished to command a stage like this. Tonight, that chorus had been drowned out by something else entirely: respect. The public response was immediate and explosive. Hashtags blazed across timelines within minutes, her words stitched into TikToks, layered with music remixed into chants of defiance. Memes painted her as a warrior, a truth slayer, a symbol of a new era. Clips of Scott's stunned silence were looped endlessly, his smirk frozen in defeat beside her fire. The digital world crowned its victor without hesitation. And yet, even as celebration spilled through feeds, Crockett knew the critics would return. Already, some voices tried to twist the narrative, branding her assertiveness as aggression, her wit as disrespect. Old habits die hard and the machinery of spin rarely sleeps. But this time, the balance had shifted. For every column clinging to the past, there were 10 more voices rising to defend her. Her dignity was no longer a debate. It was a fact that millions had witnessed with their own eyes. In that reflection, Crockett found not triumph alone, but something quieter, steadier. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing against her victory. The moment was not hers alone. It belonged to the women who had been silenced, the outsiders who had been doubted, the fighters who had been told they were too much, when in truth they were never enough for those who feared them. As the night stretched on, the adrenaline ebbed, leaving a stillness in its place. Crockett replayed the clash in her mind, Scott's smirk, her answer, the gasp of the crowd. And she realized that power was never in the interruption. It was in the refusal to bow. The storm had passed, but its imprint remained, and as she walked away from the stage, respect magnified, she carried with her both the sting of being underestimated and the undeniable satisfaction of rewriting that story in real time. By the time the debate had faded from television screens and live stream feeds, the ripple had already transformed into a wave. Jasmine Crockett's name dominated search bars, her clip replayed in dorm rooms, coffee shops, news studios, and congressional hallways. What had begun as one exchange between two figures on stage now stretched across the national imagination, a cultural shorthand for resistance, for refusal, for dignity reclaimed under fire. Crockett herself was still absorbing the scale. Within hours, her campaign phones lit up with new donor commitments, the kind of grassroots flood usually reserved for presidential announcements. Small dollar contributions poured in from first-time givers, retirees, students, service workers. People who had never felt compelled to attach their names to politics until they saw her seize that moment. For them, it wasn't simply entertainment. It was empowerment. In press briefings and on editorial pages, pundits scrambled to frame what they had just witnessed. Some attempted to minimize it, chalking up Scott's silence to strategy, a tactical pause. Others insisted the clash was overstated, a symptom of our overheated culture. But those voices were quickly drowned by the avalanche of coverage recognizing something undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had seized the spotlight, not as a novelty, but as a force. For Scott, the aftermath carried an unfamiliar weight. The senator, so long accustomed to being the polished authority in any room, now found his image circulating in slow-motion replays, the smirk that faltered, the words that failed, the silence that spoke louder than any rebuttal. In interviews days later, he tried to reframe, to pivot back to policy, to remind viewers of his credentials. But no matter the topic, every question circled back to that instant. What were you thinking when she responded? Humbling wasn't strong enough a word. For a man whose career had been built on composure, the sudden exposure of vulnerability struck deeper than a single exchange. It left him recalibrating, forced to consider that in the new political climate, authority wasn't defined by calm detachment. It was tested by whether you could withstand the truth when it came at you unfiltered. Cultural impact bloomed almost overnight. College students wore shirts emblazoned with Crockett's words. Street murals popped up in Oakland, Atlanta, Houston. Her face painted not with the polished smile of a campaign ad, but with the fire of that clapback. On TikTok, creators stitched her clip into everything from parodies to motivational edits, using her voice as a rallying cry. Hashtags transformed into movements, and what had seemed like a single debate moment began to resemble a fuse. Because for many, it wasn't just about Crockett, it was about what she represented. For years, the establishment had defined the rules of respectability: how to look, how to sound, how to earn a place at the table. And in a matter of seconds, those rules were exposed as brittle, outdated, vulnerable. Crockett's defiance was more than a rebuttal, it was a warning shot, a sign that those who had been dismissed as too much were no longer asking permission. Inside party corridors, strategists whispered about her. Could she be a national contender? Was this the emergence of a new star? Or the spark of something larger, a shift in political culture itself? Every fundraiser invitation that once hesitated to include her name now clamored to feature her. Every network panel sought her perspective, and while Crockett herself understood that media love was fleeting, she also knew that momentum was a currency. Right now, she had it in abundance. The night of the debate became a dividing line. For Scott, it marked the end of his easy authority. For Crockett, it was the moment the country looked at her not as a footnote, not as an upstart, but as a contender whose voice could not be ignored. But the deeper truth lingered beneath the headlines. The confrontation was never just about two individuals. It was about the story of politics itself. Old versus new, polished detachment versus unapologetic fire, deference versus defiance. The reaction was more than applause, it was alignment. People saw themselves in Crockett's refusal to shrink, and once they saw it, they could not unsee it. A cultural mirror had been lifted, and what stared back was raw, unvarnished, and undeniable. Still, Crockett knew that one moment, however viral, was not the destination. It was the ignition. With victory came higher stakes, harsher scrutiny, and louder opposition. She could already hear the sharpening of attacks, the framing of her passion as recklessness, the attempts to reassert the same tired stereotypes. Yet she felt something stronger pressing against the doubt, the certainty that she had cracked the facade. And that certainty carried with it a question that neither Scott nor the establishment could dismiss. If one clapback could shake a senator, if one refusal to play small could electrify millions, what would happen when that energy organized, mobilized, and grew into something more than a moment? The cameras captured the clash, but history might remember it as the prologue. For as Crockett walked off the stage, her words still echoing, her image still replaying across countless screens, the air felt charged with possibility. This was not the end. This was the warning shot. And the question that lingered, unsettled and electric, was simple yet seismic. If one clapback can shake a senator, what happens when a movement rises? Tim Scott ace KD, but Jasmine Crockett turned silence into her weapon. That single moment flipped the balance of power, not just on a debate stage, but in the story of who gets heard in American politics. You saw it. You felt it. Authority cracked. Dignity roared back, and when the dust settled, it was clear silence didn't belong to Scott. It belonged to Crockett, and she wielded it like a blade. So now ask yourself, if you were on that stage, under those lights, watching the smirk fade and the truth rise, who would you cheer for? The polished establishment voice that tried to dismiss, or the unflinching voice that refused to bow. Moments like this are rare, but their power multiplies when people refuse to let them fade. That's where you come in. Hit subscribe right now so you don't miss the next flashpoint. Drop your comment below. Tell us what you saw, what you felt, and whether you believe this was just a clapback or the beginning of a shift. Share this with someone who still thinks silence is strength, because this isn't just Crockett's story. It's yours too, a movement of voices who won't stay silent.